June 6, 1944. 00:20 hours. Normandy. Over the darkened countryside of the Cotentin Peninsula, the night air was heavy with low cloud, ground fog, and the distant, indistinct roar of aircraft engines that did not fit into any familiar pattern. German outposts manned by exhausted infantrymen reported isolated parachutes drifting down into fields, hedgerows, and flooded meadows. Reports that at first sounded routine and insignificant, the kind of false alarms that had repeated themselves for months along the Atlantic coast. German officers on duty understood airborne warfare as a precise instrument, something planned down to the minute, concentrated on a narrow objective, subordinate to a clear operational logic, and therefore predictable in its opening phase. What arrived over Normandy that night did not correspond to that expectation. Drops were scattered, units appeared far from any obvious target, and no clear Schwerpunkt revealed itself. From the standpoint of German doctrine, this looked less like an invasion than a malfunction. In the days before the landings, German assessments assumed that any Allied airborne operation would be limited in scope, aimed at a small number of bridges or road junctions to support a main landing elsewhere, and quickly neutralized by local reserves once the situation became clear. Centralized planning and strict control were considered the essence of modern war, and German officers trusted that an enemy lacking both would reveal weakness rather than strength. When the first reports came in from areas around Sainte-Mère-Église, they were interpreted through this lens: a failed or poorly executed drop, dangerous locally but operationally manageable. The absence of a coherent picture reassured rather than alarmed, because disorder on the enemy side was assumed to be a temporary condition preceding collapse. As midnight passed, however, the volume and character of reports began to shift. Messages described sporadic firing in places where no enemy was expected, roadblocks established by small groups without heavy weapons, and German messengers disappearing between command posts. These fragments did not combine into a recognizable map of the battlefield, and that, paradoxically, delayed decisive action. German officers searched for the plan behind the landings, convinced that once identified, it could be countered. What they did not yet grasp was the absence of an obvious plan was itself the opening condition of a different kind of operation. By the time this realization began to form, the night had already done its work, and the familiar logic of defense no longer applied, leaving German command waiting for clarity that would never come. Between 02:30 and 06:30 on June 6, 1944, the German command system in Normandy entered a phase of degradation that was not caused by physical destruction, but by the cumulative effect of delay, uncertainty, and structural rigidity. In divisional and regimental headquarters across the Cotentin Peninsula, officers attempted to assemble a coherent picture of events using field telephones, runners, and short-range radio sets, only to discover that the flow of information itself had become unreliable. Telephone lines were cut by scattered parachutists acting without coordination but with clear local intent. Radio traffic was intermittent due to Allied jamming and damaged equipment, and liaison officers sent forward failed to return on schedule. Reports arrived late, contradicted one another, or referred to situations that had already changed by the time they reached higher headquarters, eroding confidence in every subsequent message. German command culture depended on continuous vertical control and confirmation before major forces could be committed, especially armored reserves held under higher authority. During the critical early hours, several key commanders were physically absent from their posts, displaced by air attacks or night movements, while others hesitated to issue orders without authorization from above. Requests to move reserves upward through the chain of command stalled because no one could clearly determine whether the airborne landings represented a diversion, a limited raid, or the opening phase of a full-scale invasion. The lack of clarity did not trigger initiative but paralysis, as officers waited for confirmation that never arrived. Even short interruptions in communication produced cascading effects, freezing subordinate units in place and preventing coordinated action. By dawn, the German system was no longer reacting as an integrated whole, but as a collection of isolated nodes, each responding to local threats without awareness of the broader situation. Officers later noted that the most damaging factor was not enemy fire, but time lost while waiting for orders, approvals, and clarification. In theory, German command culture emphasized discipline and control to maintain coherence under pressure. In practice, the same structure proved unable to function once the flow of information was disrupted. The airborne landings had not destroyed headquarters, but they had severed the nervous system that connected them. As reports of seaborne landings began to arrive from the coast, German commanders attempted to shift focus, but the damage was already done. The early hours of hesitation meant that countermeasures were late, reserves were misallocated, and coordination between units broke down. What German officers confronted that morning was not defeat in battle, but the realization that a brief loss of control had rendered their command system ineffective at the decisive moment, setting the conditions for everything that followed. By the morning of June 6, 1944, German commanders attempting to impose order on the situation in Normandy were confronted with a problem that could not be solved through maps or standard operational procedures, because the concept of a continuous front line had effectively ceased to exist. Reports from battalions and companies across the Cotentin Peninsula described American paratroopers appearing in places that defied any logical sequence of advance. Small groups firing from hedgerows behind German positions, isolated soldiers directing artillery fire from church towers, road junctions blocked by men who vanished before counterattacks could be organized. German officers trained to interpret battlefield activity in terms of axes, flanks, and reserves found that none of these categories applied because the enemy did not present a mass that could be fixed, enveloped, or destroyed in a single engagement. What disturbed German commanders most was not the tactical effectiveness of these scattered groups, but their simultaneous presence across wide areas, creating the impression of an enemy far larger than reality. A platoon encountered at a crossroads was reported as the advance guard of a battalion. A brief firefight in a rear village was interpreted as the opening of a new penetration, and each incident reinforced the belief that German rear areas had already been compromised beyond recovery. German doctrine relied on identifying the main effort of the enemy and responding with concentration of force, yet the American airborne troops offered no clear Schwerpunkt. Instead, they imposed a condition of constant contact, forcing German units to divert strength to local security while remaining uncertain where the decisive threat lay. Attempts to re-establish a coherent defensive line failed because the environment itself worked against German control. The bocage limited visibility and movement, night fighting disoriented units unfamiliar with the terrain, and communication between neighboring formations remained unreliable. German officers later noted that even when local superiority was achieved, success could not be exploited because the broader situation remained undefined. The enemy withdrew, reappeared elsewhere, or simply disappeared, leaving behind uncertainty rather than a clear tactical result. The battlefield became a series of disconnected engagements that resisted integration into a single operational picture. By midday, German commanders began to understand that they were not facing a conventional airborne force seeking to hold ground, but a dispersed enemy whose purpose was to deny coherence rather than seize territory. This realization carried an implicit threat. If the rear could not be secured and the front could not be defined, then every movement of reserves risked running into unseen resistance. The absence of a front was no longer a temporary anomaly, but a condition shaping the entire battle, and German officers sensed that their doctrine offered no immediate answer to an enemy who refused to appear where he was expected. As the morning of June 6, 1944 progressed, German officers analyzing the increasingly fragmented situation began to notice a pattern that could not be explained by chance or improvisation alone. American airborne troops, cut off from their parent units and often unaware of the original objectives of the operation, continued to act with purpose, forming temporary groups under junior leaders who assumed authority without hesitation. German reports repeatedly noted that small enemy detachments operated decisively despite lacking contact with higher command, occupying key terrain, disrupting movement, and withdrawing before superior forces could be brought to bear. This behavior challenged the German understanding of command and control, which assumed that initiative flowed downward only within clearly defined limits set by superior headquarters. German doctrine formally encouraged initiative, but in practice it remained constrained by a strong vertical hierarchy and an expectation that major decisions required confirmation from above. In Normandy, this structure proved ill-suited to conditions where communications were unreliable and the situation changed faster than orders could be issued. German platoon and company commanders often hesitated to act independently, fearing that premature movement might conflict with higher-level intentions that were still unclear. In contrast, American junior officers and non-commissioned officers exercised decision-making authority as a matter of necessity, guided by broad intent rather than detailed instruction. German observers later remarked that this difference allowed the airborne units to retain operational momentum even when their original plan had disintegrated. Captured documents and post-war interviews reveal a growing respect among German officers for this form of decentralized leadership. They noted that American sergeants and lieutenants did not wait for perfect information, but acted on partial understanding, accepting risk in order to impose friction on the defender. Roadblocks were established not because they were ordered, but because a junior leader recognized an opportunity to delay German movement. Bridges were defended briefly and then abandoned, not as a failure, but as a calculated use of limited manpower. German commanders, accustomed to viewing such behavior as indiscipline, were forced to reconsider when its cumulative effect became apparent. By early afternoon, German assessments acknowledged that the American airborne troops were not collapsing under the strain of disorganization, but adapting faster than the defenders. The contrast was uncomfortable. A system built on obedience and clarity was being outmaneuvered by one that tolerated ambiguity and rewarded initiative. This realization did not yet translate to an effective response, but it marked a critical shift in perception. German officers began to understand that they were facing not just scattered enemy soldiers, but a command philosophy fundamentally different from their own, and the implications of that difference were only beginning to unfold. By the afternoon and evening of June 6, 1944, the psychological impact of the American airborne landings had become one of the dominant factors shaping German behavior on the battlefield, even where direct contact with the enemy was limited. In unit diaries and after-action reports from formations operating across the Cotentin Peninsula, German officers increasingly described a pervasive sense of insecurity that extended far beyond the actual strength of the airborne troops. The inability to determine the size, composition, or intent of the American airborne units led to systematic overestimation of their numbers. A single firefight was often interpreted as evidence of a coordinated attack, and the absence of follow-up only deepened uncertainty rather than restoring confidence. German officers later noted that uncertainty proved more corrosive to morale than confirmed losses because it prevented units from forming a stable understanding of their situation. This psychological strain was magnified by exhaustion and isolation. Many German soldiers had been on alert for weeks, responding to repeated invasion alarms that had come to nothing, and the sudden transition from anticipation to chaos produced a sense of disorientation. Commanders described men firing at shadows, patrols returning with contradictory reports, and an increasing reluctance to move without explicit orders.
Even units that retained cohesion found their effectiveness reduced by the constant need to guard roads, villages, and headquarters against threats that could not be localized. The American airborne troops did not need to defeat German units in battle to affect them. Their mere presence imposed a continuous psychological tax. In post-war memoirs, German officers frequently characterized the American soldiers encountered during the airborne phase as aggressive and unpredictable, not because of exceptional tactical skill, but because they acted in ways that defied expectation. The lack of a clear pattern undermined German confidence in their own assessments, and this erosion of certainty translated directly into caution and delay. By the end of the first day, the psychological balance had shifted decisively. German units were still intact, but their freedom of action had narrowed, and the growing sense that control had been lost in the rear foreshadowed the deeper operational consequences that would follow in the days ahead.
In the months and years after the defeat in Normandy, German officers attempted to impose retrospective order on events that had unfolded beyond their control, producing reports, memoranda, interrogation statements, and memoirs that returned repeatedly to the opening hours of June 6, 1944, as the moment when the defensive system began to fail irreversibly. In these assessments, written with the benefit of distance but without illusion, a common conclusion emerged. The decisive factor of the invasion was not numerical superiority, air power, or material abundance alone, but the disruption of command coherence at the very start of the operation. The airborne landings, though tactically disordered and costly for the attackers, had achieved an effect the German doctrine had not adequately anticipated: the destruction of the defender's ability to think and act as a unified system. German commanders noted that their pre-war and wartime assumptions about control, sequencing, and predictability had shaped every aspect of their defensive planning in Normandy. They expected to identify the enemy's main effort, concentrate reserves against it, and restore order through decisive counteraction. The American airborne operation denied them this opportunity by creating a battlefield without clear priorities, where every report demanded attention and no single threat could be confirmed as decisive. The German command structure, optimized for clarity and confirmation, proved incapable of functioning once clarity disappeared. Officers acknowledged that even brief interruptions in information flow had produced delays measured not in minutes, but in missed opportunities that could never be recovered. Post-war analyses also emphasized the contrast between the two command cultures. German officers recognized that the American system, which delegated initiative downward and accepted temporary loss of control as a tolerable condition, was better suited to the uncertainty of modern warfare than their own rigid hierarchy. The scattered airborne drops, initially judged as failures of execution, were reinterpreted as catalysts that forced decentralized action on the defender while enabling it on the attacker's side. What appeared chaotic in isolation became coherent in aggregate, while German order collapsed under the weight of its own dependence on coordination. By the end of these reflections, a sober consensus emerged among former German commanders. Normandy was lost not at the beaches alone, but in the hours before dawn inland, when decision-making stalled and confidence eroded. The airborne landings did not defeat German forces in a conventional sense, they deprived them of the conditions required to fight effectively. From this perspective, the paradox of Normandy became clear. Operational disorder, when combined with initiative and psychological resilience, proved more decisive than perfect planning. For the German officer corps, this realization marked not just an explanation of defeat, but the recognition that the character of warfare itself had changed, and that change had already sealed the outcome before the full battle had even begun.